Um, what we'll do is introduce ourselves, and then we will ask each of you to introduce yourselves, and then I'll read the question. My name is Murray Snow. I am the Chief Judge for the Federal Court in Arizona.
Good afternoon. I am Tammy Waller, and I am the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages, also from Arizona at the Arizona Department of Education.
Hi, my name is Lynn Simons, and I'm a state district court judge in the state of Nevada. I'm excited to be here to judge nationals, and I want to remind you all to take a very deep breath right now.
All right. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Abby.
Hi, I'm Andre.
Hello, I'm Lucas.
Well, hello to you all. As you know, you are here on Unit 6, which is what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century. And your question is, President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree, and why? And what disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence?" You may begin.
In his farewell address, four-star General and former President Eisenhower warns against the influence of the military-industrial complex, the iron triangle between private weapons manufacturers, the Department of Defense, and Congress. Today, we agree with Eisenhower's warning that the military-industrial complex creates dangers stemming from an over-reliance on private companies. The military-industrial complex has hindered the effectiveness of the military and distorted foreign policy objectives. While the government's goal is to produce an effective fighting force, private contractors are largely driven by money. The DoD's contracting and weapons procurement processes leave private companies sacrificing quality to maximize profits, harming U.S. military capabilities. Furthermore, the military-industrial complex is one of the largest lobbying interests in the government, investing more than $100 million annually. These lobbying efforts contribute to decades involved in long and unwinnable engagements like Afghanistan. To further maximize profits, the military-industrial complex encourages wars and overhypes national security threats in order to encourage the government to purchase their products. The privatization of the military threatens global peace rather than the presence of the American military behemoth on its own.
Now, while a few of the founders like Hamilton argued for a standing army for national defense, the vast majority, including Federalists like Madison, strongly opposed the creation of one. The founders feared that a standing army would lead to oppression, presidential abuse of power, and an unbearable taxation or debt burden. Many of these fears were supported by their experiences with the British, such as the Boston Massacre, during which British regulars killed 5 civilians. The structure of the Constitution and Bill of Rights reflect these misgivings about a standing army. Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 12 and 13 grant Congress the power to fund an army and the Navy. However, Clause 12 dictates that Congress cannot approve Army funding for more than 2 years at a time, while Clause 13 regarding the Navy has no such restriction, demonstrating the specific hesitations regarding a standing Army. Furthermore, in order to restrict President's authority, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 delegates the power to declare war solely to Congress, even though Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 makes the President the Commander-in-Chief. Finally, beyond the Constitution, the Second Amendment secures the right of citizens to bear arms and organize militias, which was seen as sufficient instead of a standing army. During conflicts, organized militias could be called to arms, such as during the War of 1812, which saw militias outnumber American soldiers 8-1. Now, today, most of the founders' misgivings are less relevant, with people accepting a standing army and protections like the Posse Comitatus Act, ensuring that the military can't be used against civilians. However, the last 70 years have seen presidential war powers exceed their constitutional limits. Congress hasn't declared war since 1942, but the U.S. has been involved in many conflicts since then. In 1973, Congress sought to limit presidential authority with the War Powers Resolution after interventions in Korea and Vietnam. However, after 9/11, Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force, which was initially only intended to be used against Al-Qaeda and other militant groups, but has since been used to justify military action in over a dozen different countries around the world. Evidently, these actions demonstrate an erosion of constitutional checks and balances regarding military action.
Since World War II, American military presence globally has generally had a stabilizing effect. U.S. forces are scattered across the globe, which helps contribute to the deterrence that they provide. Deterrence through military buildup and strong power projection has been historically proven as the best way to prevent conflicts, as evidenced by the breakout of World War II and the lack of any major global conflicts since then. Even with major conflicts, the world is generally more peaceful than it has been before the World Wars, and the strong U.S. military presence globally has heavily contributed to this. U.S. forces are stationed across more than 800 overseas bases, mostly in our NATO-aligned and East Asian allies, demonstrating American commitment to protecting those regions. However, not all intervention is good. Decades of drone strikes and bombing campaigns in the Middle East by the U.S. has caused mass collateral damage, civilian casualties, and a refugee crisis without achieving many useful strategic military objectives. While the U.S. military can be used as a peacekeeping force, our involvement in the Middle East demonstrates the consequences of a now omnipresent and extremely dangerous influence of a military-industrial complex.
All right, thank you. To whom or what did the framers give control over the military? And does this and why did they do it? And is that a sufficient check against the abuse of military power?
So ultimately, one of the primary, as we mentioned, the power to control the military specifically is directed towards the president. However, ultimately, the framers did put in the restriction that Congress also has some regulation on both the funding as well as regulation, as Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 specifically gives power to Congress to regulate any of the armed forces. And overall, I would argue that these limitations help protect against the abuse of power.
Furthermore, the framers strongly, in general, as we mentioned in our 4-minute, were strongly against an organized military by the federal government, which is why we mentioned that most, even Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed that a standing military would not be beneficial for the United States. For example, in Federalist 41, which Madison wrote, he argues that a standing army would still be dangerous to the United States, even if it is necessary, while Brutus, who was an Anti-Federalist who wrote against the Federalist Papers, also argues that a standing army would be very detrimental to the United States as a whole.
Furthering more on like the checks and balances that Andre provided in the beginning of this questioning period, we would say that currently the Congress has most of the power in having the ability to check the military, seeing how we have the AUMF and More Powers Act. But specifically after that 60-day period, Congress and the president have to come together and to determine the next course of route. So the president does have the ability to send troops to regions, but it needs Congress's approval following the 60-day period. But secondly, the most important part is the funding. So each fiscal year, Congress has the ability to fund the Department of Defense, and the department and each department under it has to justify their funding to Congress specifically. So Congress is able to specifically provide funding for certain projects that they deem important to the American democracy.
Thank you.
My question has to do with domestic deployment. Should the National Guard be deployed domestically? And if so, under what circumstances?
So I would say that currently we have seen in the past that domestically it has been beneficial. For example, with the inauguration of President Joe Biden, we saw that a lot of the National Guard's troops were sent to Washington, D.C. in order to protect the outgoing president and the incoming president. But also we saw that with the recent actions this past summer of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, we saw that the National Guard troops were being presented and held in these bigger cities with bigger protests in order to control the crowd.
Additionally, I would add that not only it can be used for things like ensuring peaceful demonstrations, but also the National Guard has historically proven to be very effective in aiding disaster relief efforts. For example, after major hurricanes such as Katrina, the National Guard was among the first responders in helping evacuate those trapped in their homes due to flooding, as well as distributing supplies and setting up relief posts where people could gather, and assisting other agencies such as FEMA in helping ensure that lives could be protected after such natural disasters.
Those, on the other hand, would argue that the National Guard deployed in the face of protests are not beneficial. For example, when we look at the BLM protests that we mentioned just a little bit ago, the National Guard was deployed to a very high involvement, meaning that we saw many guardsmen defending many cities. However, when we're looking at the riots on Capitol Hill against Joe Biden's election win in November, we saw a lack of National Guard security stopping people entering the Capitol, which shows a dichotomy in the interests of the National Guard, which may include a racial biases, but that's just what those on the other side may argue against.
So I heard your testimony to be that you support international presence, and specifically using the Spratly Islands as an example. What are the positive or negative aspects of a U.S. military presence there?
For example, just as any U.S. international military presence there is that added benefit of helping the economy within the area. So we see that a lot of local regions that we have U.S. military presence in, the overall economy goes up. We've seen that happen in other places such as like Guatemala or even Africa or even Southeast Asia more specifically, that when we have U.S. military presence and the large amounts of U.S. military presence, the overall well-being and the economic status of the area increases.
Also, as a whole, I would contend, despite the contentious issue focusing around the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, because of the high tensions of the region, U.S. deployment is generally a good thing because it demonstrates to other allied nations, such as the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, which also have interest in the region, that we are willing to stand by them and protect them and prevent from the aggression from other nations, such as China, who has been seen building artificial islands in the South China Sea and trying to extend their influence into ways that might not agree with what the general commons accepted under international law.
Like Andre mentions, deterrence is a really key strategy in stopping China from expanding their reach on a global sphere. For example, if it weren't for the United States intervention in the South China Sea, it's very likely that China would be in Taiwan right now. But furthermore, in general, about U.S. military presence, those against it, like we mentioned, our 4 minute would argue that our presence, especially in the Middle East, has been very detrimental. Further, to expand upon our 4 minute, we would also like to say that our efforts may actually lead to increased amounts of terrorism because of the fact that collateral damage from drone strikes may lead to greater resentment against the United States, which leads to greater involvement within terrorist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
Kind of following up from what Lucas said, another negative benefit that the people of the region see specifically is that historically, people who are in the U.S. military have had poor past with, let's say, abuses within the area. We see this in Taiwan specifically and the other regions within Asia, that we have proper usage of people, personnel, as well as mismanagement of money funds. So that is a negative benefit that happens towards the people and especially our military.
So should the government require all citizens to register for the Selective Service? Why or why not?
As a whole, I would say that generally registering for the Selective Service is becoming less and less of a necessity, just as given the overwhelming scope of the U.S. forces, given that already approximately 2 million military service members are in action. However, I would still say that the requirement should be kept for all American citizens in the event that in some potential conflict scenario that they may need to be called upon. But even given that the likelihood, especially of that actually happening, is very, very low.
I would argue that in current day, it's not necessary to have a selective service draft. We saw with the Vietnam War specifically, there was a lot of backlash and a lot of protests that happened because of the draft. But we would say that currently right now, going on to Andre's point, that there is a lot of active members and there's a lot of increased attention rate for people wanting to go into military. For example, we see that in our local high school, especially, there's a lot of promotion of having the ability to join the National Guard, to join the Navy, to join the Army. So that type of promotion has increased in the past.
Thank you very much. I'll start off. I thought the presentation was very good, very engaging. You did some very nice constitutional applications. We heard about the Federalist. We heard about the Anti-Federalist. I always like it when we hear about both sides of an issue. I thought if I were going to tell you what the specific strength I thought of your presentation is it was responsive and it was thoughtful and it wasn't canned. You listened to our questions, you gave us good answers, and they were thoughtful answers. I will tell you that this is the first time I've heard the War Powers Act before today. but I haven't heard anybody who had the slightest idea how the War Powers Act operated until this presentation. So I think your responses were thoughtful, substantive, constitutional application was good. Sometimes Andrej and Lucas, you're speaking a little soft, and with the masks, it makes it a little more challenging. I can hear Abby better than I can hear you two, so you might speak up a little bit in the future presentations, but I thought you were excellent.
Yeah, I also thought it was an excellent testimony and follow-up questions, and just the responsiveness. I feel like my criticism is always, make sure you listen to the question, but I'll have to say that to you guys because you listened to the question and then you directly answered it. You countered each other, supported each other. I thought that flow was really exceptional. I thought your opening presentation was really intriguing, the beginning of it, and I wish I had time for a follow-up question on it, but that idea that maybe the use of military is not the big issue, but it's the use of the defense contracting industry, and that's the first time I've heard that as really focusing on that aspect of the question, and I thought that was really unique and different, and I love hearing something new. My only critique would be to slow down. You guys talk really fast, especially in the beginning, because I know you have a lot to say, but it takes us a while to process it as the judges, so we can really hear it and reflect on it. So I might say, take a little bit of a deep breath beforehand and just kind of slow down your pace in your opening. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and I echo what my colleagues have said. And in response to, I thought you worked really well together in response to my question, because Abby started it off and then the other two brought it home with some details I haven't heard today. So I thought that was really well done. And I did, I appreciated that you took a position, and but I was also fascinated by the part that you were talking about the lobbying efforts and kind of that whole financial aspect. We really hadn't heard that. My only constructive criticism would be the same, just slow down during your testimony. We all have our committee in our head that thinks, oh, we're talking too slow, but usually you do have to talk just a bit slower than you would naturally do. But well done, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Good luck the rest of the day.